Today, we see yet another episode of the Western-backed countries openly supporting the terrorists. It is not unusual, since the goal of the Western countries was to degrade the Syrian infrastructure, support terrorists to depose the government, and to topple President Assad. For the uninitiated, here is a summary of what has been going on in Syria. Syria has been selling oil in euros and refused to allow Saudi Arabia and Qatar to build a pipeline through its territory to Turkey, as well as join the existing pipeline between Syria, Iran and Iraq to it. This proposed pipeline is supposed to carry natural gas bound for Europe and would give Europe the ability to cut off its Russian natural gas supply as part of the economic war against Russia in the Grand Chessboard campaign to conquer Eurasia, install American puppets for a new American century. Since negotiations did not work on President Assad, the Saudis created a Friends of Syria group and actively sought to undermine the government. More contemptible is the fact that Saudi Arabia sends its death row inmates to fight in Syria in exchange for amnesty. Additionally, the US openly supports all terrorist groups operating in Syria, while at the same time pretending to denounce ISIS and claim to be bombing them. The US treats ISIS terrorists as moderate rebels the instant when they take off their signature ninja suits, and treats the very same people as humanitarian workers, when they don white helmets. The White Helmet organization is also funded by the US, and the propaganda film featuring these terrorists was even given an award for Best Documentary in 2016. Anyway, before the Russian airstrike started, ISIS kept expanding and seemed like an undefeatable enemy, except to the Kurds. The mainstream media also reported that ISIS has set its goal on conquering most of the Middle East and could target Europe, in their attempt to make it seem like bombing Syria is the right thing to do, even when the US and its vassals are intruding Syria's airspace to do so. Even more comical is the underreported fact that US aircraft regularly return to base with their weapons unspent. However, the Russian air campaign proved the duplicity of the Western countries, by blunting the ISIS advance in less than 6 months, and helping the Syrian army claim Palmyra and Aleppo against all odds. Even more comedic is the fact that terrorist propagandists so loved by the Western mainstream media posted their Goodbye World, and Aleppo genocide messages on Twitter that gained a considerable number of replies condemning President Assad and his army, only to turn up alive the next morning for TV interviews. The first overt US support for the ISIS terrorists was witnessed when US, British, Danish and Australian aircraft participated in the bombing of known Syrian army positions at Deir ez-Zor for an hour, acting in concert with an ISIS ground onslaught. The bombings caused roughly 100 Syrian soldiers' death. This is an act of war, to say otherwise, and to call it a mistake is highly irresponsible, distasteful and a bloody lie. How would Americans react if 100 American soldiers were killed? Israeli jets have also been bombing the Syrian army, in support for the terrorists, many times. Additionally, it is widely known that injured terrorists are transported to Israel to recuperate. Prime Minister Netanyahu himself visited these injured terrorists and expressed his support for them during the visit. In the meantime, the Syrian Democratic Forces, also backed by the US, is calling for a safe zone in the territories that it controls, undoubtedly starting the process of balkanizing the Syrian state. Divide and conquer has always been the modus operandi of the Western imperialist forces, and they have perfected their technique through a lot of practice. These bombings and covert support for terrorists are all acts of a war of aggression, which is the very thing that the United Nations, and the now defunct League of Nations, professes to stop. Unfortunately, for all the highfalutin crap the United Nations spews regularly about world peace and human rights on a regular basis, it has neither had the courage to condemn and enact embargoes and blockades on the aggressor nations that disregarded Syria's sovereignty, nor has it removed the offending forces through the use of force. This is because of the facts that the United States possesses nuclear weapons, spends roughly half of the world's total military expenditure, and pays the lion's share of the United Nations funding. When it comes to dollars and cents, principle and human rights take the back seat. The United Nations was set up to prevent the rule of the jungle where might is right, and has failed pathetically. This is not the first time, though. One only has to look up the number of wars the US has been involved in, civilians killed, as well as the toxins that will continue to kill, maim and cause deformities for eternity. Yes, eternity is not an exaggeration. Depleted uranium, an industrial waste, is used in US weapons because it is cheap, heavy, and can be used as a penetrator. The US has been using such weapons all over the world, causing babies to be born so deformed that if you have the stomach to look up the images, you would quickly come to realize that many of these blobs of flesh hardly look human, if at all. The half-life of this highly dangerous substance is 4.468 billion years. Yes, billion with a B. The sun would literally cease to exist before the substance turns into a stable, non-radioactive substance. This is part of the soft kill program in the global depopulation effort, led by the US. Even if the US were to kill 1 million people today, people would reproduce and life would go on, and the trauma of war would lessen over time. However, with the use of depleted uranium, not only are the living killed, but millions are also killed through cancers, and innumerable human beings still unborn would be born as highly deformed blobs of non-functional babies who could be considered lucky if they contributed to the infant mortality rate and not suffer their whole lives due to the debilitating deformities that they were born with. Once again, where is the UN? It is completely quiet on all of the crimes against humanity. It was quiet when the US armed and funded terrorists all over the world since World War II, quiet when the US and allies bombed other countries, quiet about depleted uranium and all the harm that it has done to the victim populations thus far. Let me hear what you have to say in the comments. And do subscribe, share and like the video. Lastly, it is known that social media platforms are using their apps to spy on you, as well as censoring, shadow banning users that post political views contrary to that of the company's owners, as well as giving the NSA direct access to their IT systems. So, do give the feature-rich privacy-oriented free app, Node, a go, and recommend it to your friends.